Chapter 25 of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25, Problems. "I don't know," said Chrissy again, seeing that Fay still lingered wistfully. "I am afraid we are too late to do anything for Emmeline except to pray. God sometimes does things to stop people, Fay, when they cannot be stopped in any other way." "Chrissy," said Fay, hesitating, her cheeks taking a deeper hue and looking down in evident embarrassment, "I don't know what you will think of what I want to say, but, though I know that Emmeline and Sarah are not right, and that there is a great difference, still, since they think so, at least Emmeline does. Sometimes I think Sarah only talks things because she likes to, but if Emmeline feels that way, maybe I ought not to—" She broke off in inextricable confusion. She had not been in the habit of expressing these inmost thoughts save to Janet. But Chrissy, curious as to what might be coming, would not help her, other than with a gentle "Well, dear?" waited until she began again abruptly. "I mean, Chrissy, if I could be excused from being an angel, I would be so glad." Another moment in which Chrissy could have laughed, had not tears seemed the wiser expression. "I know there is a difference, Chrissy," was repeated with touching earnestness, "but then, she truly cannot seem to see it, and so—" "And so, shall the weak sister perish for whom Christ died?" Chrissy did not repeat the words, but they seemed to be repeated to her with startling clearness. "You shall not be an angel unless you choose," she said soothingly, accompanying the words with tender kisses. "Not now, at least," she added, with a sudden thrill at her heart over the knowledge that Fay was very frail looking. What if she should be intended for the society of the real angels before long? Those night rehearsals and heated rooms had not been physically healthful to her at least. The committee was, on the whole, as considerate, I think, as could have been expected. In a sense, they "appreciated the situation," as Mrs. Hollister said they would. It is true they pleaded for Chrissy to come just a little while, for one of her parts, the one hardest to fill. But when she was resolute, they said, "Well, you do look jaded out, that's a fact. We'll have to get along without you somehow. But it doesn't seem as though we could." There was a loud wail over the lost angel. Really, they must have Fay, the very sweetest and most natural angel in the group. Couldn't she come for just a little while? They would take excellent care of her and send her home in a carriage as soon as her part was over. Or, couldn't Chrissy come and look on, to see how they managed without her, just for that little time, then she could take Fay home with her? But Chrissy was emphatic, almost sharp in her refusal. Fay must certainly be excused. They had all been through a very heavy strain, and Fay had borne all her strength would admit. When they were fairly out on the street again, they talked it over, and on the whole, as Mrs. Hollister had said, were considerate. "I think they might have let Fay come at least," said one, and added immediately, "but she is a very frail looking child, and I suppose they feel especially nervous just now." "I thought Chrissy would certainly come and look on a while, after all the trouble she has had," said another, and a third was ready with the response, "Oh, I don't know. That would be almost as hard as performing, when she has had so much to do with it. I suppose her nerves are all unstrung, poor thing. She looks as though she had had a fit of sickness herself." Then the second speaker again, "They almost idolize Harmon. He is the only son, you know, and he is nice, real good-hearted and accommodating. I always liked Harm Hollister. They say he looks dreadful. I don't suppose he is really out of danger yet, and I heard that his own father said it was only a question of time with him." As if it were any other than a question of time with all of us. It was on the evening of that day that Dr. Hollister sought a confidential interview with his second daughter. There was a small, pretty room opening from Harmon's, a sort of second best guest chamber, to be used on occasion. It was very neatly fitted up with a single bedstead and all the usual comforts. Said Dr. Hollister, "Daughter, what would you think of occupying the room next to Harmon's for a few nights, and keeping a little oversight of him? Are you too worn out for that?" "Oh, no indeed, papa. I should like to do it." "You see," said Dr. Hollister, sitting down with an air of relief, as having found one whose nerves were sufficiently quiet to let him talk rationally with her about the sick one, "it is this way. Harmon is out of present danger, I hope, but I am very anxious about that cough, and I would like to know just how much he coughs during the night. I would like to stay with him myself, but he is nervous and would get the impression at once that I thought him in danger, which in his present weak state would be bad for him. Your mother is nervous too, and I have to keep down her fears as much as possible. I had thought of getting one of the medical students to stay nights and care for Harmon's comfort, but I can see that he dislikes the idea very much, which would make it unwise. On the contrary, he seemed quite pleased with the thought of your being near him, so if you do not feel that it will keep you awake too much, we might try it. Most of the night you can sleep probably." She hastened to assure him how ready she was, and how careful she would be. He looked relieved and pleased, but still waited, as though he might have more to say, taking a meditative walk meanwhile up and down the room. Then, "Chrissy, you asked me just before this illness about Harmon's state. I do not wish him nor your mother to know it, at least at present, but he is in a very critical condition. His lungs, if not permanently diseased, are in imminent danger, and his habits of life in almost every direction are utterly against him. If he were like a very few young men whom I have known, I am sorry to say they are a very few, we might make a brave fight through the next few years with some hope of success. But as it is," he drew a heavy sigh, and after a moment added, "as it is, we must do the best we can, and be ready for failure. That was not what I intended to say to you. I hardly know how to word what I want to say. Perhaps I do not know what it is I want, only you give me the impression sometimes that you are different from most young ladies, have different aims and hopes. I am on ground that I do not understand very well, but I felt like saying to you that if you could do something in some way for your brother, to help him, I would be glad. The fact is, daughter," his voice growing husky, "in my 30 years' practice I have had occasion to stand looking on at a great many deathbeds, and there is a difference in them, a great difference. There is no gainsaying that. Every physician knows it. I would not have my boy come to such a deathbed as I have seen for anything this world contains. And yet, the life he lives—" He broke off abruptly again. Chrissy's face was wet with tears, and her voice was tremulous. "Oh, papa, I know what you mean. Harmon needs the Lord Jesus Christ. He needs to be shown the way to him, to accept his friendship for life, or... Papa, I will try the very best I can to help him. I haven't done it. I've been cruelly thoughtless. I don't know as he will listen to me, but I mean to try. Dear papa, if you were only a servant of Christ, you could help Harmon so much better than I, or than anyone else could." He smiled on her, a very grave, sad smile. "I do not know," he said. "Sisters can do a great deal for their brothers if they will. At least, some sisters can. But, Chrissy, you will need to be very prudent indeed. Harmon is extremely weak. This attack has taken his strength fearfully. It will not do for him to be excited or disturbed in any way." And then they were interrupted. It had already been a longer interview than the suffering world often gave the busy doctor time for, with his family. Chrissy's personal appeal remained unanswered. Forgotten, she thought, in the father's anxiety for his son. She moved into the little room at once, Harmon seeming pleased at the idea. He murmured that he was going to be as peevish and exacting as a sick child, and that she would have a horrid time, but he smiled in saying it, and looked as though the prospect rather comforted him. Then began days, and especially nights, that were to be long remembered. It was not that Harmon grew worse. Instead, he rallied steadily, and his father grew daily more cheerful about him, assuring Chrissy that she was a famous nurse, and that he would recommend her heartily whenever she grew tired of running societies and wanted to take up the business. Still, there was a good deal of coughing, enough to get Chrissy wide awake by midnight, and require her patient ministrations sometimes for an hour or more, often less as the days passed and the disease yielded by degrees. But when the paroxysm was over for the night, and Harmon had fallen into quiet sleep, and Chrissy had carefully darkened the night lamp again, and tiptoed back to her room, came hours of wakefulness, when absorbing topics of thought came and stood before her, utterly refusing to be put aside until daylight, and sternly insisting on being gone over then and there. They were not wasted hours. Although it seemed almost impossible to reach any conclusions in regard to some of the subjects, others were carefully gone over step by step, and decisions made from which Chrissy felt in her soul she should not waver. Nevertheless, the way looked perplexing to her. Chief among her questions of absorbing interest was how to redeem her pledge to her father and help Harmon. There were days in which it seemed hard to help him, though she felt, as the days passed, that they were becoming very well acquainted indeed. Harmon was evidently well pleased with his nurse. He was uniformly gracious to her, though there were gloomy hours when he had only gruff words for others, even his father, and almost silence for her. Yet, after ever so short an absence, she was greeted with a glad smile, and in various nameless yet distinctly felt ways he made known that her presence was very agreeable indeed. That was not to be wondered at, for she exerted herself in every possible way to please him, anticipated not only his wants but his whims, and consulted his tastes in the smallest particular. "You will spoil him even more than he was," Mrs. Hollister said one day, watching her ministrations with a smile, well pleased that he should receive the petting. "He always was a spoiled boy." A fond smile for the boy accompanied the words. To her eldest daughter, Mrs. Hollister said, "It is strange how many specialties that child has. She is a born nurse, and I should never have imagined it in the world. She does a dozen little things for Harmon's comfort that I should never think of. I do hope that circumstances, or fate, or something, will not succeed in spoiling Chrissy. She would make a splendid woman." The sentence closed with a sigh, whereat Louise laughed. "Why, mamma, you seem to feel lugubrious about her. I don't see any occasion. She is very far from being spoiled. As for the streak of fanaticism that troubled you, I think Ches Gardner is fully equal to managing it and any other whim which attacks her. I'm sure he has succeeded very well thus far. Look with what admirable skill he has manipulated that Christian Endeavor Society, until from being a cause for annoyance, it has become quite a pleasant resort. Horace and I were talking about joining it." "I don't know," said the anxious mother, speaking doubtfully. "Chrissy is the sort of girl one can never tell anything about. She wouldn't have anything to do with that entertainment at last, you know. Though, to be sure, one didn't wonder at that, but she hasn't attended a meeting since. It doesn't suit her for some reason. I knew that before Harmon had taken sick." "Oh, mamma, You are borrowing trouble about Chrissy. She will do you credit at last in every way. I know what is the matter with her. She was dreadfully frightened over harm, as we all were, and being at a most impressionable age, it takes her longer to rally than it does older people. She feels as though she must never leave him again for fear something will happen. She will recover from that and all her other whims in due time. I'm so glad she has Ches Gardner to manage her. He is eminently prudent and at the same time skillful. Do you think he is seriously interested in her, Louise? Why, bless your heart, Mamma, one would suppose you had forgotten your young days. I know he is. I have been through the experience too recently to be mistaken. A happy little laugh following these words showed that Louise Hollister believed her experience to have been in every sense a joyous one. Well, then, do you think she understands it and feels kindly disposed toward him in that sense? As to her understanding it, I can't be sure. Chrissy is peculiar in some things, I will admit. But as to approving it, when she does come to understand herself and him, why, Mamma, what possible reason could there be for her doing otherwise? It is Ches Gardner, you know. She seems very young, said Mrs. Hollister with a sigh. Not a deep sigh. She felt a shadow of loneliness creeping over her at the thought of so soon giving up her second daughter. But then, as Louise had said, it was Ches Gardner, and his name covered every mental, moral, and society requirement that a sane woman could wish for. So she answered only with a smile Louise's final sentence. Young? Why, she will be 19 in another summer. Girls are often married at that age. And Ches is rich enough to wait several years if he pleases. If it is frightfully expensive business. Look at this pin set in diamonds that Horace bought me yesterday for my birthday. He wouldn't give it to me on the day because it was when Harm was so sick, but he never forgets special occasions. That's why I say it is so expensive. They all seem to forget after they have been married a while. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. Fiddlesticks. At last Harmon was downstairs again, was riding out on pleasant days, was beginning to talk of going out to his club once more, thereby making his father say decisively, "Not until the weather is better and you are stronger than you are now." And Chrissy was still wondering how she could help him, wondering if her present efforts were something like the attempts of the society to win the railroad men. The entertainment, by the way, passed off in a most satisfactory manner, and was pronounced a brilliant success. The morning papers complimenting some of the performers by name, and in a language so fulsomely flattering as to make Chrissy shudder and throw down the paper in utter repulsion. The railroad men had attended in large numbers, and had been won into passing resolutions of thanks at their next club meeting. It was also told as a joke that one was overheard to say it wasn't every evening that a fellow could get invited to a first-class theater and nothing to pay. Chrissy had not yet attended one of the meetings. There was an ostensible reason for this. A slight cold, contracted when Harmon was at his worst, had given her sufficient excuse to play the invalid, so far as going out evenings was concerned. But Chrissy's constitution was not delicate, and no one ever worried about her colds. Besides, it was quite gone now, and calls for her were growing louder and more frequent. Sarah, in particular, was very frank to express what she had heard. "The girls say you are a pretty president. They say they excused you as long as Harmon was at all sick, but now that he is able to be out again, they think you ought to be in your place, and I think so too. Yes, they had the regular meeting, of course, only you might have called it rather irregular. The treasurer made a full report. They made quite a little money at the entertainment, Chrissy, for all the expenses were so heavy. They had a discussion as to what should be done with it. Some of them want to spend it in getting a few costumes for tableaux and charades, you know, that shall belong to the society. Just a few yards of black and white, and then bright colors, and some diamond powder, and silver and gold paper, and such common things as these, which are used for almost everything. Some of them did not like the idea, however. I think it is an excellent one. They want to get up a cantata next. A perfectly lovely one, Estelle Brainerd says. She says she knows you will like it because there is a queen in it who has some exquisite singing to do, that you could do beautifully. But Belle Parkman said she didn't think you were tall enough for a queen, and that the music ran too high for your voice. She wants to be queen herself, I guess. Mr. Gardner said you were the only one of the entire company who could possibly personate a queen, but he didn't say that before Belle. The girls say of course he would think so. Well, Chrissy, you needn't frown at me, all the girls say so. They say he thinks whatever you do is a little nicer than anybody else can do. Still, he seems to get along with all of them very well, and they all like him ever so much. I don't. I think he is too dictatorial. I hope you won't marry him, Chrissy, ever. He tries to manage too much. He even tries to manage me now," with a marked emphasis on the now. "He asked me about the book I was reading the other evening, and said it was too old a book for me to read. The idea! He showed his ignorance there. The chief character in it is a girl not quite 2 years older than I." One might as well try to stop a brook from flowing downhill as to stop Sarah's tongue when she was well under way. Chrissy opened her lips to ask the name of the book, then closed them again, feeling that this was not the time, nor was she in the right spirit to speak wisely. It was as much as she could do to get her few questions about the meeting answered. "Why, of course they had singing. Enough of it, too. Some of the hymns they sang were real silly, I think. After the first part of the meeting was over, the Glee Club sang once. A lovely selection. What did you say? Prayers? Oh, they didn't have any praying this time. No, I said they didn't. They couldn't help it. You needn't look so vexed. There was nobody to pray. The theological students are gone home. It is vacation, you know. I told Belle Parkman that our Joe knew how, but she giggled so loud I was ashamed of her. Why, they chanted the Lord's Prayer for the opening. Why wouldn't that do just as well, Chrissy, every time? Or why need they open all the meetings with prayer? They don't at the other clubs." And this was Chrissy's Dear Christian Endeavor Society, patterned after the one at Western. Perhaps nothing opened that young lady's eyes more effectually to the state of things than to realize suddenly that the caricature of Bingen on the Rhine, which would have been such a terrible mistake at Western, would not be glaringly inappropriate at any of these meetings of hers at any time after the first 15 minutes. Meantime, Grace had responded to her letter and question by sending her a small, gray book containing less than 100 pages, all told, with this hurried note accompanying. Dear Chrissy, I am, like yourself, very busy, though in a different way. I am teaching, you know, and have been made president of our society. We are having precious meetings. Several of the girls made the great decision only last night and signed our active membership pledge. Stuart Holmes is not with us, you know. We miss him sadly, of course. But there are some splendid boys growing into young men here, getting ready to take his place. I never spent a winter at Western before. It is almost as pleasant, in a different way, of course, as it is in the summer. Chrissy, dear, I do hope you can come back here next summer. You will enjoy hearing so many new voices. An interest is extending to the school. 2 of the girls in my geometry class are growing interested in more important problems than they find there. As to your question, I send an answer fuller and much more satisfactory than any I can give. Plain Talks About the Theatre, by that grand man, Dr. Herrick Johnson. Stuart Holmes gave the book to me once when I asked him how to answer one of my Sabbath school boys on that question. I think every young Christian ought to read it, in order to help them in being thoroughly furnished. I cannot say you will like the book, because the revelations in it are too solemnly terrible for one to apply that word, but I can say that the book will help you to a distinct and intelligent conclusion on the subject in question. And that, I am sure, is what the writer of it wanted to accomplish. My school bell is ringing. Goodbye, dear. May our Father keep you in his love. Grace. This very plain book Chrissy studied until brain and heart were fairly on fire with the thought of the terrible mistake which was being made by the intelligent Christian world, of which even her own mother was a member. Why did not people inform themselves in regard to these questions? Why had it been left to Scotch Janet, the nurse, to try to build her little wall of protection around the children? While these questions were being painfully revolved in her mind, came an evening when she had opportunity to ask some of them. Ches Gardner dropped in, as he had done frequently during Harmon's illness, and finding that young man comfortably established in the back parlor with his mother, as well as Chrissy, for company, boldly presented his appeal. "Miss Chrissy, you are growing pale. You have too much indoor life for your good, I imagine. Let me break in on your seclusion and carry you captive to the Duane Street Theatre this evening. One of your favorite Shakespearean plays is to be presented." Chrissy's refusal was so prompt and decided that even Mrs. Hollister hesitated, but the flush of annoyance on Mr. Gardner's face emboldened her. "Why, Chrissy, I see no reason for your insisting on remaining at home every evening now. Harmon has been a bit of a tyrant, I know, but he can manage to tolerate his mother's company this evening, I fancy. Your father was speaking of the play just after dinner, and said he would like to attend if he possibly could." "Go, by all means, Chris," interrupted Harmon. "I wouldn't keep you at home such a splendid evening as this for the world. I'd even accompany you if my father had not grown positively bearish and babyish about me." Then Mrs. Hollister: "Go, child, and get ready. Your dress will do very well if you brighten it with a ribbon or two." "Mamma, I do not wish to go. Mr. Gardner, I found that piece of music for which you were inquiring last week. If you will come to the music room, I will sing it for you now." As he followed Chrissy down the long room to the alcove partly cut off from the main room by heavy curtains, and called the music room, there was still that shade of annoyance on his face. Chrissy found the music in quick silence and sang the verses, saying as she finished, "You see, Mr. Gardner, I was right. The third line is an almost exact reproduction of the strain from that old opera we were discussing, and the accompaniment suggests two others. But I did not ask you here to discuss this music. I wanted to define my position in regard to my refusal of your invitation. I am not going to attend the theatre any more." "No?" he said, lightly, elevating his eyebrows, but speaking as one who was resolved to be prepared for anything which might come. "This surprises me. I thought the theatre had a special fascination for you. I am not myself particularly anxious to see this play. It was your pleasure of which I was thinking. What has become the matter with theatres?" "It is nothing new, I fancy, so far as they are concerned. It is rather that I have been ignorant of their true nature, and have had no opinion about them, simply because I accepted them without thought. Your own talk with Joe about the circus was almost my first enlightenment, Mr. Gardner, since which time I have studied the subject carefully." "But surely, Miss Chrissy, you do not class the theatres to which I invite you with the travelling circus?" "I do not class them at all. I merely say that some of the arguments you advanced apply to the one as well as the other, and were unanswerable arguments. They convinced Joe, and they have me. At least, they set me to thinking and to studying. I am not going to try to argue with you. I am only stating my position. I have discovered what I ought to have known before, that there are no theatres but have their nights in which they cater to the appetites of the low and immoral. My eyes have been opened to the fact that even some of the most popular plays which it is the fashion to admire, educate the morals downward. It is like the gilded saloon preparing its first-class victims to graduate into the low-down groggeries. I will lend you the book I have been studying, if you wish it, Mr. Gardner, and are interested enough to read it carefully. But for myself, I feel that the question is decided. I settled it on my knees, and I have no doubt that it would be wrong for me to attend the theatre. For other people I do not presume to judge." "Very well," he said, after just a moment's pause. "Then we will consider the question settled so far as you are concerned. Neither do I presume to judge, nor to dictate. I will read your book with pleasure, Miss Chrissy. Not that I feel the need of argument in this matter, but because I want to hold myself always open to conviction. Moreover, I confess to being very desirous of understanding you." There was a marked emphasis on the pronoun which Chrissy did not notice. She was occupied in thinking how entirely his face had cleared from its dissatisfaction, and in wondering over and admiring, as she had 100 times before, the readiness with which this man, not a Christian, accommodated himself to the wishes and plans of others, yielding his own preferences with a grace and heartiness that seemed unusual even among Christian people. They returned to the back parlor, where Mr. Gardner devoted himself to making the evening pass pleasantly to the invalid, with such success that Harmon said of him, the moment he was out of hearing, "He's the best fellow in the world, always ready to give up his way for the sake of others, and to do it with a good grace, too." "It is more than can be said of some young people of my acquaintance," Mrs. Hollister said. Chrissy's face flushed, and Harmon laughed. "That is true," he said good-naturedly. "Chris, it was my gain, and I am immensely obliged. Therefore, I can afford to speak plainly. Most fellows would have gone off to sulk if they had been treated to so cold a refusal as Ches Gardner received tonight." "It was childish," said Mrs. Hollister coldly. "It could be called nothing else. He probably took that into consideration and was patient. Though I should suppose he might consider your sister old enough to be governed somewhat by courtesy instead of whims." "Mamma," with a little accession of dignity, "it was not a whim which governed me tonight. It was principle." "It was fiddlesticks," said her mother irritably. "I haven't much patience left, I know that, and I don't understand how his can hold out much longer. I tell you plainly you are very silly to annoy him in this way. He would almost be justified in leaving you to your peculiar principles. Even Ches Gardner will not bear everything." "Mamma!" in a great fever of wounded feeling and indignation, "I do not understand you in the least. Mr. Gardner is not obliged to bear with me in anything. My principles are my own. So is my time, so far as he is concerned. I do not know why you speak in this way to me." "Then you are an unmitigated simpleton. That is all I have to say." "He plays a good game," said Harmon musingly, evidently not considering this little family hurricane worth noticing. "I was surprised at that. I really think he would beat any of the fellows readily, and yet he never takes a hand at the club." End of chapter 26. Chapter 27 of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27, Wise as Serpents. Over this last sentence of Harmon's, together with a conversation which followed hard after, Chrissy pondered anxiously. Dr. Hollister had come in before any response could be made to Mrs. Hollister's emphatic opinion of her daughter, if indeed Chrissy had had any to make. Not feeling equal to meeting her father at that moment, Chrissy had retired to the alcove which was called the music room, ostensibly to gather up the music and close the piano. Harmon, meantime, had risen, and waited only to say good night to his father and mother. Left alone, Mrs. Hollister began to tell her husband how kind Ches Gardner had been. Calling with an entirely different plan for the evening, he had graciously put aside his own preferences, and exerted himself to make the evening pass pleasantly to Harmon. "Played cards with him all the evening," said the admiring mother, "though I heard him say once that they were an actual bore to him." Chrissy, about to enter the room, could see the perplexed frown with which she was growing acquainted gather on her father's face, and could distinctly hear his reply. "I could wish that his benevolence had taken some other form. Harmon, unfortunately, does not consider cards a bore. He plays altogether too often for his good." "Nonsense! Dr. Hollister, what a croaker you are getting to be! As if there could be any harm in his joining in a social game of cards here in our own parlor. I should think you would much prefer it to his being at the club. You must be taking lessons of Chrissy. If you progress at this rate, we shall have 2 fanatics in the house instead of 1. She has utterly exhausted my patience for this evening. What do you think she has done now?" Whereupon Chrissy fled in haste and noiselessly. But over the card episode she thought anxiously, as I have said. If you are accustomed to doing careful thinking along these lines, that is, if, as a young person, you have been brought up in the atmosphere of an advanced Christian home, you will doubtless be surprised that a girl like Christine Hollister could have reached the age of 18 without having pronounced views on all these points. It may be well for you to know her thoroughly to help you to be charitable to those in her position. It simply had not occurred to Chrissy but that to play cards occasionally or frequently for social amusement was the legitimate thing for young people in society, just as it had not occurred to her until very recently that there were some Christians who set their faces like a flint against all theaters. Of course, to gamble was low and vile, and of course there were plays to which people of refinement would not listen. But neither of these facts had, until within a few weeks, affected the classic drama and the parlor card table. Suddenly and solemnly the former question had been settled, on her knees, as she told Mr. Gardner. Not a doubt remained in her mind. But no sooner was it disposed of, than behold, here came another, which her father's tone and her own enlightened conscience, coupled with her logical mind, helped her to see might very possibly be relegated to the same world to which the theater evidently belonged. It sent Chrissy to bed that night with a painful sense of having been defrauded some way of her rights as an intelligent Christian, in not having been thoroughly trained, logically, on these and kindred questions, until at least she should have known what she believed and why she believed. "My father is a believer in a certain school of medicine," she said to herself, as she tossed uneasily from side to side, turning her pillow often to find a cool place for her cheek. "And ever since I was a little child, I have been trained to talk understandingly about it, to know in what general lines he differed from the other schools, and why, and to give a reason for my adoption or rejection of certain views. And I am not expected to practice medicine either. But here is my mother, a believer in a certain line of ethics as laid down in the Bible, I suppose, and I am expected to practice in just the same line all my life. Yet what do I know about the position which I ought to take on any moral question beyond the plain laws which govern the civilized world? When I confront my own mind squarely, I find that I do not know why I believe, or do not believe, anything which relates to Christian ethics. Even Janet and Joe know more than I do about these things. I wonder why Mamma—" Here the questioning came to an abrupt pause. One law she knew at least. The one who had said, amid the thunders of Sinai, "Honor thy father and thy mother," was listening now, and must not hear this disciple of his arraign her mother for unfaithfulness. "To his own master he standeth or falleth," was another familiar verse which floated through her mind. Also this thought: "Perhaps poor mamma was brought up as I have been, and nobody ever said things to make her stop and think. If there were only more people to help others think out things!" She tossed to the other side of the bed, changed pillows entirely, and drew a long, tired sigh. It was of no use to go over her list of friends. "What is the matter with my friends?" said poor Chrissy. "Grace is a long way off. And beside, Grace is different from me in another direction from the rest. I have taken it for granted that things are right, as a matter of course, and she has taken it for granted that they are wrong, and neither of us know why." It was evident, even on the very slight examination which she gave it, that Ches Gardner was the most intimate friend she had, and he was certainly not to be leaned upon, was not even a Christian at all. "He would be positive enough," said Chrissy, trying to analyze his position, "but he does not start out on the same platform. It is not with him an all-important argument that Jesus Christ would, or would not, have done thus and so. But since it is, with me, why have I not known? Gambling holes! That is what papa calls them. I have been taught to look upon them with horror. And the very same kind of cards are used in them, which are used in our parlor this evening. Even the very same games played sometimes. And papa evidently sees that Harmon is being led into danger by cards. It is Janet's old rule. They choose their style of game and we choose ours. And they cannot understand the difference, and we have not brains enough to see the one fosters a taste for the other. I wonder how many more things there are." I am sure you are glad to know that, unable to answer this question, she went to sleep. And the next day was Sunday, a dull, dreary, rainy day, a day which tried Harmon's soul to the utmost. He had planned to go out in the evening to a choral service in one of the uptown churches. He was very fond of music, and was very tired of staying in the house, and he gloomed and growled until his mother, pitying him, petitioned his father to know if they called a close carriage for Harmon and he wrapped up well, whether it could hurt him. And the father, tried by what seemed to him the childishness of his son, in the face of a great physical risk, and the ignorance of his mother, declared angrily that he had no patience with any of them, that a 5-year-old child would know better than to go out on such an evening, after barely getting up from such an illness as Harmon had had, and that if he went out tonight, he needn't expect him to try to bring him through. All folly, of course, and the father knew it. So did the son. Knew that should he go out and get wet to the skin and come home ill, no one would hang over him with more persistent, skillful care than his father. Yet, with the strange perversity of the human heart, it vexed him to hear himself spoken of in this way. "One would think that I was a child of 10," he said to his mother, "bound to obey father's every whim. I don't expect to get sick again for him to take care of. He needn't worry. I'm going to take every precaution, and I don't believe in such nonsense as that it would hurt me to step from the door into a carriage if it does rain. I'm tired of moping at home. Sunday evenings are worse than any other." "Oh, but," said the alarmed mother, You know you must not go after your father has said what he has." Chrissy, listening, could not but feel that this, to a young man like Harmon, was the very worst thing that she could have said, and resolved to make a bold dash into the midst. Fortunately for her, she was not supposed to have heard a word of what had preceded. For all that appeared, as she stepped in from the hall, she might just have descended the stairs. She went over to Harmon, standing moodily by the window, laid her head caressingly on his shoulder, and said, "Could you find it in your heart to pet me tonight? I'm not a choral service, it is true, but I'm a piece of one. I'm learning a most difficult part from an oratorio, and if you would let me sing it to you this evening after the others have scattered, I'd like it ever so much." He looked down on her doubtfully, the scowl on his face letting up a little. She was so pretty, and her head rested so comfortably on his shoulder. "I thought you wanted to hear Dr. Dullard's guest preach tonight?" he said. "I did, but it rains, and little Fay cannot go out. And Emmeline has a great desire to go for some reason, and I thought I would pet Fay for a while, until 8 o'clock, provided you would pet me afterwards." "Very well," he said, smiling, "but I was going out myself this evening, you know." "I remember, but being a person gifted with the ordinary amount of common sense, of course you would not risk such a rain as this, while a vestige of that cough lasted. I took that for granted." This seemed to the young man somehow a very different way of putting the thing from what there had been before, and in a half hour from that time, it would have been hard to have persuaded him that he had entertained a serious thought of going out. No one tried. Dr. Hollister went away well pleased, more than ever convinced that sisters could do a great deal for their brothers if they would. As for Chrissy, it was more than an oratorio that she wanted to present that evening. Not that her statement was not strictly true. She sang the difficult part several times, indeed, surprised by her brother's correct taste and discriminating criticism, and was unsparing in her thanks for his help. In the very midst of one of the solemn, majestic strains, when her voice was rolling out high and pure, she came to a sudden stop, whirled herself from the music stool to a little hassock at Harmon's side, laid her head on his lap, and said, in a voice throbbing with earnestness, "Oh, Harmon, I wish you and I could be quite one on this subject. I do so want a friend." He placed his hand caressingly on the brown head, and looked down on her with a smile as he said, "What a queer little puss it is! How did you jump so suddenly to so different a theme?" "It isn't different, Harmon. It is the same theme. Didn't you hear that line? 'In the Lord put I my trust'? That is my confession of faith. So do I, utterly, entirely, forever. Could I help wishing that I might say to you, isn't it glorious, Harmon, that we, you and I, have such a trust, a tower of strength that will never fail us, come what may? It would be so pleasant to talk it over with you, to live it with you." She had raised her head to look at him as she spoke, but it dropped again as soon as the sentence was concluded. It was a most sincere sentence. She felt utterly desolate and friendless. Friends enough, but none of them satisfying. None of them sympathetic, so far as this question of questions was concerned. A little more sore on this account, her heart was, because of a conversation which she had had with Chess Gardner since the entertainment. In a gentle, guarded sort of way, she had taken him to task for his share in the embarrassment in which she found herself, taken him to task without his discovering it, weighed him indeed, and in some respects found him wanting. What had he thought of her for not taking her part in the tableaux and charades and all the rest? Why, he had thought her eminently excusable. Did she suppose he would have liked to have that weight put upon her after her long strain of sleepless watching and anxiety? But what would he think if she should tell him she should not have kept the engagement even had Harmon not been taken sick? What would he say to the fact that she had grown more than surfeited with the whole thing, had come to believe that it was putting her in a position of most unpleasant notoriety? Well, with a little laugh, they would not quarrel on that subject, he imagined. It was, perhaps, being unnecessarily particular, but now that she asked him, he would confess that he liked quite as well to see her in her own dress and character as posing in a representation, however beautiful it might be. That was being over fastidious, he had no doubt, and he certainly should not have pushed his opinions had she chosen to gratify the committee, but as it had turned out, he was eminently satisfied. But did he think that well, to put it plainly, that street loafers, if she might use the term, were in the habit of talking over such entertainments when they were gotten up among the young people in an exclusive way, as theirs had been, and managed in the interests of a church society? Did he believe it was necessarily a conscientious place to occupy? As to that, street loafers talked, he must confess, about anything which came to hand, and showed very little respect for church or position. Nothing very dreadful could be said, of course, yet it was presumable that their entertainment had suffered at the hands of this class, in common with other doings of the day. That was to be expected. It was not pleasant, and he could but be glad, as he had said, that her name was not at last included. Chrissy asked no more questions. She turned away, looking grave. He saw the gravity, mistook its cause, and exerted himself to draw her thoughts away from the unpleasant topic, to convince her by his manner that nothing certainly which she had done had changed his estimate of her in the least. But what Chrissy was thinking was somewhat after this fashion. He has felt this all the time and been silent, allowed me to plunge heart and energies into that which, to say the least, has, it seems, its questionable side. He says he is outspoken, that he admires frankness, treats his friends to it, and asks it at their hands in return. Has he been frank with me in this thing, does he think? Did he suppose, I wonder, that I understood the talking world as well as he did, and accepted their talk as one of the evils which must be endured? Stewart Holmes did not so judge me, and that is not his idea of frankness. These thoughts were not what I may call formulated. They simply floated in a sort of chaotic state through Chrissy's mind, increasing her unrest, and making her feel more than ever, as she waited for Harmon's answer, that it would be blessed to have a brother to whom she could speak freely, sure of being understood. End of chapter 27. Chapter 28 of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 28. Suppose I should. His answer, if answer it may be called, was not such as she could have wished. How is it, Chris, that you seem to be so different from other girls of your set? So different from yourself, I may say? I don't remember you as such an earnest little thing in this direction. You were intense enough, I know, and original for that matter, but there was certainly a difference. What happened to you in that little dried-up village where you spent the summer? Is that what did it? I found it there, Harmon. Then, after a moment of intense thought and a little breath of prayer for guidance, she began in a low, sweet voice to tell him the story of her Western experience. Not as she had told it to Grace Norton in its first flush of beauty, not as she had told it to Ches Gardner behind the curtains that December day, but with a simple, tender pathos, born of experience and some regrets. Told it more in detail than she had meant at first, for Harmon was listening impressively, as one who was held by an influence outside of himself. Very simple and plain she tried to make the story of her final self-surrender, of her solemn signing of the pledge which made her by her own act not her own, having freely, fully, and forever accepted the terms on which she had been bought with a price. Once he interrupted her. "But you were a member of the church, Chris, long before that. I remember as well as if it happened yesterday, that Sunday you stood up there before the altar, and bowed your little brown head in assent to all that reading, very little of which I understood." "Neither did I, Harmon. I thought I did. I was sincere enough. I think now that if I had been taught what it all meant, and how I should live, I would have been different. But I don't know," with a little sigh. "It is very easy to get astray, even when you think you are on the safe road. I know this, Harmon. I never deliberately felt what it was to give myself utterly to Christ, until that evening when I signed the Christian Endeavor pledge. I have never for a moment regretted that promise, nor desired to be free from it. But it is easier to live right in Western than it is here." Whereupon she launched into a description of the Christian Endeavor Society at Western, and of the young people who centered about it, and radiated from it in all directions, and made it glow with life and power. Being just then all but heartsick for a ray from its shining, she told her story well, so well that when at last she paused, Harmon said, "And that was the sort of society you wanted to start here? Out of Louise and Horace and Belle Parkman and Ches Gardner and me. Poor little Chris." "Yes," said Chrissy humbly, "and the thing I have started, named for it, isn't it at all. And I cannot help it, nor get rid of it, and everybody calls it mine. It needs making over, Harmon, just as people do. I was reading in the Bible today about the Valley of Dry Bones, and I could not help thinking that that was precisely what our society needed. We have the bones, and they are all standing about in regular order, officers and committees and subcommittees, if we could only be breathed upon." She spoke with an intensity that was almost startling, having for the moment forgotten her auditor, being engaged only in voicing the cry of her soul. Her brother did not laugh. He did not even look amused, but regarded her with an intent, half-curious gaze, his face presently glooming over until it might have been discovered by one watching that he had gone into the depths of some thought which troubled him. Chrissy was not looking at him. Presently her thoughts came back to him, and without raising her head, she murmured, "If I could only have you, Harmon, to help me, to be in sympathy with me." There was no reply. A silence fell between them for several minutes. Then, in a low, almost sullen tone, Harmon spoke. "I ought to think about these things, I suppose. In fact, I know well enough that I ought. Father thinks he has hoodwinked me, made me believe I was getting as well as I was before. I hoodwink myself. Pretend, you know, that there is no sense in coddling me, and that I hate to be babied. Yet all the while I know it is the coddling and babying which keeps me here at all. And I know, as well as father does, and as I overheard Dr. Douglas say, for all they kept it from me so carefully, that it is only a question of time. And a very short time at that, I dare say. A fellow as well posted as that, who knows he isn't in the least ready to die, ought to set to work at once and get ready, of course. But the fact is, I can't. Can't even want to. I haven't had a remarkably good time in this world, somehow, for all I've tried hard enough to, and I don't know but I may as well go in now and get as much pleasure out of it as I can, and let the rest go." His sister was looking at him now, all her soul in her eyes. She interrupted him eagerly. "I don't want you to get ready to die, Harmon. It was not of that I was thinking at all. I thought of it when you were sick, but tonight All my thought was, how splendid it would be for you to get ready to live, to be the kind of man that I know you could make. Outspoken for true and right and noble things. Can you possibly imagine what a joy, for instance, it would be for me to say, my brother does not think such and such things are right, and to have your position such before the world that the thoughtful ones would turn away with a doubt in their minds to be argued over, with a feeling that said, if such a man as Harmon Hollister speaks against it, there is reason to hesitate. Don't you know what I mean, Harmon?" Yes, he knew very well indeed. She had gauged her brother with a good deal of skill. It would be a pleasant thing to him to be looked up to be depended upon as a man of consequence, to have his opinions carry weight with them. He knew very well that he was not now such a man, except indeed in certain lines. It is true that none of the fellows at the club cared to make a purchase of a horse until Harm Hollister had tried him. It was also true that he was often shouted at by some of his friends to know what he thought of a certain brand of cigars. But these, he knew, were not the questions Chrissy meant. Neither did he mean them. He had had other ambitions. He went back in memory to a certain day in his early youth, when a man whom he admired, whom all the boys admired, was a guest of one of the professors and interested himself in them all, and did more for them during the 5 days of his visit than any man had ever done for them before. He remembered how the boys had said, one and another of them in moments of confidence, "I'd like to be such a man as he is." He remembered how the professor one morning at prayers had said, "Young gentlemen, if you should make it your ambition to fill such a place in the world as my friend who has just left us, and should succeed, the world would have reason to honor and bless you." In his secret soul, Harmon had told himself then that he meant to be just such a man. "And there isn't a trace of him in me. I've made a failure of it," thought this poor, pale youth of 24, skilled in selecting horses and cigars, and in arranging and presenting bouquets of expensive flowers, and weakened mentally and physically by late hours and rich suppers and choice wines. But his sister must be answered. "To tell you the truth, Chris," trying to throw off the sense of gloom and speak lightly, "I've never been such an admirer of the Christians with whom I have had to do, as a rule, as to care to imitate them. They have seemed to me amazingly like the rest of us." She did not try to tell him how weak and maudlin such an excuse as this was, how unworthy the breath of a person of brains. If she had, he would have argued with her, and without making a single logical deduction, would have been able to point to so many brilliant failures as to apparently strengthen his position and weaken hers. Chrissy felt too humbled to argue. "I do not wonder at that," she said simply. "I felt in exactly the same way, and said it too, although I knew it amounted to very little as an argument. Yet it served me well as an excuse. It is an unanswerable fact that there are many exceedingly weak imitations of the real thing. But I'll tell you another fact, Harmon Hollister. There is such a person as Jesus Christ, and he will bear just as ardent admiration and as close scrutiny as you can give. He isn't a bit like the rest of us, but people can and do grow like him in a degree if they really want to." It wasn't in the least the sort of answer he had expected. He had expected her to argue. He had heard a great many semi-witty surface arguments concerning Christianity based on the shortcomings of its professed disciples. He had felt as though a little tilt with this bright young sister would be interesting. He needed enlivening. But he was not prepared to argue as to the consistency of Jesus Christ. It came to him suddenly, with overpowering force, what a thing it would be to grow like Christ. He was not ignorant in regard to what this thought meant, nor could he in the least plead ignorance as to the way to begin this growth. In his early boyhood he had been blessed with an earnest and faithful Sabbath school teacher. He had been well taught. He had, several times in the years past, almost reached decisions. But those times seemed to him long past. He had not imagined that such fancies would ever possess him again. Suppose he were one of this sort of men? How little he should care then for the coughs and fevers and wasting flesh and weakening limbs, of which he was at times so painfully conscious. Suppose he could look the grim monster whom he hated squarely in the face and say, "Yes, I am on my way to my inheritance. You are welcome, for you have come to hasten the journey. I expect to settle on my estate before very long." A man of title! His mother thought a great deal of titles. She had an ambition for him to go abroad to complete his education. She had had a hope that he might possibly meet some of the nobility. What if her own son should become heir apparent to the throne? Does the motive seem to you a low one, an unworthy one? Was it not for the purpose of rousing our ambition that the terms heirs of God, joint heirs with Christ, were repeated to us? At all events, the thoughts thrilled through and through the sluggish soul of this young man, moving him as he had never in his life been moved before. There came to him then and there an intense desire to make the acquaintance of the man Christ Jesus, to become intimate with him. There came more than a desire. Creeping through his veins, quickening every pulse in his being, came that mysterious, solemn, all-potent "I will," the only thing for which the Lord waits before he can save a soul. Chrissy did not know it. The young man did not even know it himself, did not realize, I mean, that with the determination came the solemn power of omnipotence to seal the bond. He only knew that he trembled as though in a chill, and felt the perspiration starting on his forehead, and yet felt strangely jubilant, as if, perhaps, he might almost give a shout if he were alone. What he did was to bend forward and kiss a little brown curl which was straying over Chrissy's forehead, and murmur, "You are a grand little sister, and I won't forget it." It was not the answer which she had desired, but I cannot say that she was disappointed. She was sowing seed as well as she knew how, and praying for a harvest. But like many another laborer, she did not really expect a harvest. Not now, at least. Had some swift angel, on his way to give the news in heaven, paused and whispered to her, "In another moment all the choirs of this celestial city will burst forth in hallelujahs over a soul new born," she would have inquired with eager interest, but with utmost ignorance, "Who is it?" Among the first things that Chrissy Hollister did next morning was to make her way to No. 14 Meridian Street to call on Nellie Tudor. Nellie, who had come to spend the season with an aunt and take charge of her little cousin's studies, had been thoughtful and patient during these weeks of waiting for opportunity to renew her acquaintance with Chrissy. While Harmon was still seriously ill, she had called twice to leave bouquets of exquisite flowers, with her love and sympathy for Miss Chrissy. Once Chrissy was sleeping, after a long night of watching, and could not be disturbed. At another time she was with Harmon, and made it an excuse for being excused. After that Nellie had waited for her, wondering a little, it is true, as the days passed, but making excuses which Chrissy did not deserve for her non-appearance. The truth is, perhaps one of the hardest things that Chrissy ever did in her life was to go to Nellie Tudor for help out of her present difficulties. Once there, it seemed as though she would never get away. The story was long, had many windings and turnings, and there were bypaths which did not seem to belong to it at all, yet that had to be gone over before the main track could be clearly seen. Through it all, Nellie was eager, sympathetic, tender, and humble. Moreover, she was helpful. She had grown. That was evident. Taken long strides forward, indeed, during the months that poor Chrissy could but feel that she herself had gone backward. The keen insight which this girl, who had been supposed to be so frivolous, had into the subtle difficulties and embarrassments, and the straightforward way she had of taking it for granted that a thing once proven to be right was to be done, however difficult, both surprised and humbled Chrissy. She had been hesitating for some time over certain things which she knew to be right because they were difficult. Moreover, Nellie had an inexpressibly soothing way of saying "we," as though she included herself in the work to be done, and meant to stand shoulder to shoulder with her friend. In fact, Chrissy found, to her grave bewilderment, that she actually was, before this interview was over, leaning on Nellie Tudor. "I'll tell you one thing, Chrissy dear. If we could get Stewart Holmes to address them, it would be worth ever so much. You don't know how earnest he is. Why, yes, you do. Know all about him, don't you? But he grows, Chrissy. Oh, he is just absorbed. It really seems as though the Lord has raised him up for just this work, and as though no young people could hear him without being helped." "She is very sweet," said Chrissy to herself, as at last she bade Nellie good-bye and hurried homeward. "Very sweet indeed. I do not wonder that he finds in her all he does. Yes, she has grown very much." And then Chrissy sighed. The evening mail carried the following short letter to New York. "Mr. Holmes, dear friend, I thank you. Our regular meeting of the Christian Endeavor Society is to be held on Friday evening. New York is but 2 hours from us, and the spring arrangement of trains now gives us one each hour after 3 o'clock. Could you find it in your heart to come and help us? We want to reorganize on a different basis. We need help sorely. If you can, I am sure you will, for the sake of Jesus Christ. Your friend, Christine Gordon Hollister." End of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 29. Reconstruction. Stewart Holmes had one other paper in his possession signed with the same name. He put this away with it in a private drawer in his secretary, and took the 4 o'clock train, on Friday, for the little city 2 hours away from the great one. It had been a busy week for Chrissy, and, in many respects, a sad one. In order to be ready for Friday evening, a good deal of her preparation was of necessity retrospective. Yet, after all, it was a better week than any she had had for some time. The feeling of unrest, of painful indecision, was gone. She knew just what she meant to do, and moved with straightforward step toward its accomplishment. One little drop of exceeding sweetness came into her life on Friday morning. She was coming uptown in a streetcar. A plainly dressed girl of about her own age, with a good earnest face, sat opposite her, watching her with an intentness that was only excusable because of the absorbed and almost tender light in the girl's eyes, which lifted her act far above the commonplace stare. At last, seeming to have gathered courage for a resolve, she arose and took a vacant seat beside Chrissy. "I beg your pardon," she said in low, well-bred tones. "May I speak to you? I am a stranger, but I see that we are kindred." Touching as she spoke the tiny silver badge she wore, bearing the magic letters C.E., and glancing significantly at the corresponding one of gold which fastened Chrissy's linen collar. There was an instant clasping of hands and an exchange of cordial smiles. "I thought I might venture," the stranger said. "I was especially anxious because I was in this city. Do you live here? Then let me tell you a little bit of a story. I am one of the clerks at Hearn's, in New York, you know. I had never heard of the Christian Endeavor Society, and I had never done much thinking of any sort. Only to think how I could have as good a time in the world as possible. But one of our girls came here in December to spend her vacation, and she went to one of the first meetings of your society in Gardner Hall. Is that yours? Well, and she heard the Constitution read, and the pledge, and all that. And she liked it all so much that she came home and told about it, and did not rest until she had started a society out of our class in Sunday school. I joined as an associate member, because I was ready to do whatever the others did, but I got acquainted in that society with Jesus Christ. I signed the other pledge, and gave myself to him forever. And I've had a good winter. We do enjoy our society so much, and it has always seemed to me that this one here ought to know about ours, because it is the mother of us, you see. We've been having lovely meetings. Several of the girls in my class have signed the full pledge this winter. Excuse me for speaking to you. I couldn't help it some way. Perhaps you will like to tell your president. Callie said she was a sweet-faced young girl. Goodbye, I get off here." Almost before Chrissy could murmur a tremulous, "Oh, thank you," she had received a cordial nod and smile, and the stranger was gone. Tell the president! Yes, indeed, she would. Tell it over to her own heart, tell it to Jesus on her knees, in the humblest strain of thanksgiving her soul ever knew. Unfaithful, unreliable in every way, yet he had used her in the harvest field. Without having an engagement with her to do so, Chrissy had hoped and believed that Nellie Tudor would call for her on Friday, but she did not. Chrissy, coming down at last to join Emmeline and Sarah, found that there was other company. Louise and Horace were in the hall, dressed to go out and waiting for her. "We are going with you," Louise said. "Horace has been talking about it for several weeks. He has quite caught the fever. Are the exercises to be interesting tonight, Chrissy?" "I do not know," said Chrissy, her face growing a shade paler. At that moment Harmon came from his room. "I've escaped," he said, smiling as he buttoned his overcoat. "Even father thinks the night is so fine that there can be no possible risk in my going out." "Whither?" said Mrs. Hollister, lingering in the hall to see the party off, and returning the smile of her son. "Going with Chrissy, if she will let me." "Really?" the mother said, well pleased, turning now to smile on her second daughter. "You are becoming the most popular young woman in society. Almost the entire family in your train. If I had not to keep Fay's cough in charge, I might be tempted to join you just to learn the source of the bewitchment. There, you are all superseded now, I fancy." This last in a lower tone, called forth by the sound of the bell and Chess Gardner's voice. "Is Miss Chrissy—" he began to Emmeline, then with a smile for Chrissy, "Yes, I see you are. May I take care of you?" The entirely well-pleased mother looked after them all with admiring eyes. What a mistake it would have been to have checked her daughter's ambitions with regard to this organization! How exceedingly well she was managing the whole thing. Or rather, how well he is managing her through it, was the amused mental comment. As for Nellie Tudor, she reached the hall a few minutes late, and Stewart Holmes was with her. While the opening hymn was being sung, a penciled note from her told Chrissy the story. "The train was 20 minutes late. I waited to show Stewart the way, so there might be no unnecessary delays. He will speak directly after the opening if you wish. I told him I thought you would want him to pray at the opening. Is that so?" Chrissy crushed the note in her hand, inclined her head toward Nellie for answer, and joined with steady voice in the verse that was being sung. My mistakes his free grace will cover, my sins he will wash away, and the feet that shrink and falter shall walk through the gates of day. She did want Stewart Holmes to pray, and there were those present who never in all their after lives forgot that prayer. "Is he a minister?" was Sarah's question on the way home. "Well, he prayed like 6 ministers all put into one." The meeting was largely attended, and in the air seemed to be that curious sense of expectancy which close observers have sometimes noticed on the eve of a crisis of some sort. Expectancy, even on the part of those who have no reason for thinking that anything unusual is to occur. A moment, while the young president's head was still bowed on the table before her, then she lifted it, and in the hush arose and began to speak, her clear voice filling the room. I will not undertake to tell you what she said. Not that it was not simple and direct enough, but it was one of those things hard to repeat, unless one could also have repeated the atmosphere which enveloped it. A synopsis of failure, Chrissy was wont to call it long afterwards. The story, in brief, of what the Christian Endeavor Society really was, and what she, taking its bones without its spirit, had made of it in their church. She laid the blame nowhere else than on herself. She was not bitter, even about herself. She was simply honest. She did not want them to think that she was discouraged and desired the society to drop into oblivion. She had never in her life longed for a real, genuine Christian Endeavor Society as she did tonight. But she wanted the great head of the organization to breathe into them the breath of life, so that they might indeed become living souls. She hoped the society would reorganize, would profit by her mistakes and failures, and become the spiritual power that it ought to be in their church. To this end, she would, with the close of this meeting, resign her position as president of the society in the hope and belief that there could be chosen one who would reconstruct it on a more solid ground. As her last official act, she proposed to ask Mr. Holmes, of New York, to give them a few words of advice. I certainly wish, for the sake of the cause, that I could report to you that young man's words. It was no set speech which he gave them, carefully written and memorized. It was not even what Stewart Holmes had meant to say when he reached the hall. He knew from Nellie Tudor that the president meant to resign her office, but he had not known that her explanation of the causes which led to this step was to be so full, so humble, and so solemn. If Sarah Hollister thought that he prayed like 6 ministers, she must have felt, during the 20 minutes he occupied, that he preached like the embodiment of a dozen. Certainly the listeners felt that they had never before heard from a man of their own age so impassioned an appeal for whole-hearted service. What followed was as bewildering to Chrissy as to any person present. It appeared that Nellie Tudor, though a very recent addition to their number, had been by no means a passive one. She knew exactly what she wanted to accomplish, and had taken careful steps towards accomplishing it. In less time than it takes me to write it out, the president's resignation had been accepted, Stewart Holmes had been appointed chairman, 2 of the theological students had expressed their desire for an organization of the very sort which Miss Hollister had described to them, then there had followed certain developments which surprised Nellie Tudor with the rest. One and another of the quiet members, who had heretofore kept very back seats, and maintained strict neutrality, declared their sympathy with the ex-president's views, and their earnest hope for a genuine society which should borrow the soul as well as the name of the true organization. Moreover, certain members who had apparently been among the gayest and most absorbed workers, confessed in few words their belief that they had made a mistake, and that their consciences had often hinted that something better than they were doing ought to be done. "In short," said Chrissy, weeks afterwards, when she was writing out the story for Grace Norton, "I believe I went to the meeting feeling that I was a sort of Elijah under a juniper tree. Like him, at least, in that I thought I was the only one who had not entirely bowed the knee to Baal, and almost ready to request that I might die. I did long for a true society, but I did not expect it. I did hope they would organize on a different basis, but I did not believe they would. Judge, then, of my utter astonishment to find how many there were ready to sympathize with my most advanced hopes and longings, ready to much more than meet me halfway." When the voluntary testimony was concluded, which was so much more than Nellie Tudor had planned, that young woman, with very satisfied eyes, proceeded to carry out her scheme, and showed her skill as an organizer, or else the oneness of sympathy that there really was among the young people, when the entire membership arose to their feet to vote that Miss Christine Hollister be elected president of the reorganized Christian Endeavor Society. I do not know what Chrissy would have done with this movement, had it not been for a surprise which all but took her breath away. She had been very honest with her resignation. She had been honestly distressed over the unexpected re-election. She was genuinely sure that she was not the one to lead. The election had been rushed forward with most unparliamentary haste, but she was on her feet to make earnest protest when the society was electrified by a new voice. "I want to say," came in clear-cut words across the hall, "that through the efforts of one of the members of your Christian Endeavor Society, I have been led to choose Christ for my leader. I want to serve him with my whole heart. I hope someone will propose my name here tonight as an active member of this reorganized society, and I pledge you my most active efforts to sustain it in its new character." "Harm Hollister," murmured Belle Parkman, nudging her companion and speaking in a half-hysterical whisper. "What next? I'm not going to be surprised now at anything." Joe, the stable boy, put his head down suddenly on the seat before him to hide the rush of tears. Joe was not surprised. He had been expecting something of this kind, watching for it. It was just what he and little Miss Fay had been praying about ever so long, and Joe was a literalist and expected results. But he was very happy. As for Chrissy, her distress and her doubts and her shrinkings from further leadership all went off in a thrill of thanksgiving so lifting her out of herself that her speech was, "Oh, I don't know. I meant to say that I couldn't, but, if you think I can, I feel now as though I was willing to try to do anything." There were several scenes yet to live through that night. "Such a succession of excitements!" declared Louise the moment they were home. Chrissy was there, but Harmon had not yet come in. "Mamma, you ought to have been there. Talk about dime novels! The sensations in the best of them are as nothing compared with what we had tonight. Mamma, what would you think of your daughter Christine as a preacher? She did preach a regular sermon, didn't she, Horace? Did it well, too. I had no idea that excitement could carry a person to such lengths. There was something intoxicating about it, though. Really, Horace, at one time I did not know but you were going to catch the spirit of the hour and follow suit." The gentleman thus addressed was perfectly grave, and answered with marked coldness, I confess I did not see anything amusing in the gathering. I like to see people in earnest, if the thing they are talking about is worthy of it." "There, mamma, didn't I tell you it was a wonderful meeting? You see Horace is almost ready to become a preacher himself." "What are you talking about, you silly child?" said the smiling mother. "I'm talking about wonderful things, and you sit there unmoved. You ought to get up and be excited. We all are. Wait till Harm comes. What do you say to Harm speaking in a prayer meeting? That was what it was, a regular revival prayer meeting." "Harmon!" exclaimed Dr. Hollister, throwing down the paper which he had been pretending to read, and rising suddenly to his feet. "Yes, sir, Harmon. Spoke well, too. Didn't he, Horace? I never was so astonished in my life. Papa, you'll have 2 ministers in your family before you know it, Chrissy and Harm." Whereupon the door opened quietly, and the son of the house entered, pausing midway to take in the excitement of the moment and its cause, if he could. They were all very much excited. Louise, perhaps, most of all, though attempting to cover hers with a flow of wild words unlike her in several respects. "Is anything wrong?" asked Harmon, looking from one to another of the family group. Dr. Hollister was the first to respond. "My son," in a strange, moved voice, such as Harmon never remembered to have heard from him before, "is what your sister is saying true? Have you become interested in religious things, Harmon?" "Yes, sir, I have. I meant to tell you tonight. I have turned over an entirely new leaf, Father. I'm going from this time forth to serve the Lord." "My boy!" said Dr. Hollister, holding out his hand, his voice trembling as none of his children had ever heard it tremble before. "Nothing that ever I heard in my life was as good as this. I haven't got it myself, but I know there is such a thing, and I have coveted it for you." "Seeing number 16," said Louise, low-toned, but with a half-hysterical laugh. "Louise, don't," said her affianced husband sharply. End of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 30. An Unappreciated Sacrifice. You are not to suppose that life became all rose color for Chrissy Hollister. There were many perplexities and embarrassments. As the days passed, it became increasingly apparent to her that one cannot in a single evening, however much in earnest one may be, undo the mistakes of previous weeks and months. There was Emmeline, for instance, whom possibly she might once have influenced, even as Ches Gardner had suggested, slipped quite beyond her reach, bent on marrying herself to the fiercest and sullenest looking clown of which any traveling circus in the land could boast, and going off with him on her perilous life, to trials and dangers that Chrissy, in her sheltered home, could only with bated breath imagine. Also, there was Ches Gardner himself, a source of constant torture to poor Chrissy, though all unintentionally so far as he was concerned. To understand it, you need a bit of history relating to the days which immediately followed the evening of Reconstruction. Of course, Mr. Gardner accompanied Chrissy home. He had waited courteously while she said her good-byes and earnest thanks to Mr. Holmes, who had gone back to New York on the 11 o'clock train. He had been kind and careful of his charge during the homeward ride and walk, had kept her wraps thoughtfully about her, had shielded her from drafts on the street cars, and in every way shown his thoughtful, protective care. Had bidden her his usual cordial good night at the door, and then had gone home to think. This young woman interested him profoundly. The study of human nature which he had commenced through her, had some time before narrowed into a study of her. He was interested in the problem of Christianity in a general and dignified and gracious way. He was interested in Chrissy Hollister in a profound and daily increasing way. It was becoming apparent to him that this fair, unworldly, simple-hearted girl was growing necessary to his happiness. There were things about her which he did not like, and they had to do with this very question of religion which had at first drawn him into studying her. He approved of her being a Christian woman, but a Christian woman who would not occupy him to the theater or opera, who declined to dance, even with him, who frowned on all games of cards, even for social parlor entertainment, who broke loose from the ordinary church entertainments, not because she was too exclusive for them, that idea he would have approved, but because she did not think them right. All these things, his mother said, were religion run mad. He confessed to himself that many of them were inconvenient. Then, when she added to them that remarkable stand which she took in the meeting, that remarkable talk which she made, he was undecided and ill at ease. He had said to himself that he could shape her acts to suit his will. He admitted to himself that an influence greater than he possessed over her as yet was certainly shaping her acts without regard to his will. He went home, as I said, to think. The result of his thinking was the conclusion that Chrissy Hollister, with her fanaticism, if fanaticism was the proper name for it, was more to him than all the world beside. He resolved to sacrifice his tastes so far as necessary, and conform his life so far as at all convenient, to her standard, wherever she would not yield to his, and to make her happy at all events in her own way. In short, he resolved to make a sacrifice, to overlook certain things for which he was sorry for the sake of certain other qualities which had won him. With this in view, he came one evening, not long after the society had taken its new lease of life, prepared to tell his story in a frank and manly way. Mr. Gardner knew that he was superior, could not help knowing it, in fact. In one way or another he had been told so by every person with whom he had come in contact all his life. He believed that he was conferring an honor upon any woman whom he asked to share his life. But he believed this in no offensive way. He was always, and in all respects, a gentleman. He also fully believed that Chrissy Hollister would confer an honor on the man whom she accepted. Had he not believed this, he would not have desired to secure her for himself. He did so desire most heartily. His entire better self was in the thought, and he did most emphatically expect to succeed. Judge, then, if you can, of his surprise and bewilderment almost equaling his dismay, when Chrissy, with a face alternately flushing and paling, not because of the excitement naturally attending such an experience, but because of real distress, struggled to make plain to him what at first he seemed unable to understand, that she could not accept his sacrifice. "But, Chrissy," he had said in his bewilderment and pain, even after she had thought the interview all but closed, "let me understand this if I can. It is so sudden, so strange. You will pardon the question. We have been close friends for so long, and my attentions have been so universally accepted that I cannot seem to realize your meaning. Am I to understand that you did not at any time mean other than ordinary friendship?" Then Chrissy, in great distress and embarrassment, hesitated, shrank from what she felt perhaps ought to be said, and finally, with resolute will, took up the cross. "I will be entirely frank with you, Mr. Gardner. There was a time when it seemed to me I could give you, if you should ever wish it, much more than friendship. At least, I felt that I was in danger of reaching a point when it might not be possible for me to give only that. I thought about it a good deal and prayed about it. I studied your character to learn whether it was such as I could rest in. I do not know that it would be considered womanly to think in this way before ever one was sought, but I have never quite understood why. It seemed to me that an intelligent and conscientious girl ought to be able to know whether she would be willing to put her life into the keeping of another before he was ready to ask the gift. At any rate, I thought of it, and came to the conclusion that, whatever may be right for some, it would not do for me to give my choicest friendship to one who did not love and serve my Lord. I found that I needed helping in this direction almost more than in any other, and that you were not helping me. Rather, you were, never intentionally, I believe, but by the force of your preoccupied mind, leading me farther away from Christ, making me every day better satisfied with the world. Then, on my knees, I promised my Saviour that only those who served him supremely should have first places after his in my heart. After that, Mr. Gardner, I came to the conclusion that my fancies, which I had vaguely entertained for a time, were but fancies; that you meant only kindness and hearty, unselfish friendship such as I could return, and I gave myself up to the pleasure of it, so that this which you say to me is a revelation and a pain." He had flushed under some of her words, although at others his face had brightened. He understood her perfectly as regarded his own manner. There had been a time when he had almost asked her to be his wife, and then he had been held back by a sudden flashing out of theories which had seemed to him fanatical, and calculated to build up barriers between them, and he had gone over the question again coolly, carefully, coming slowly once more to the inevitable conclusion that, despite the drawback, there was only Chrissy Hollister for his world. "I understand you," he said, speaking eagerly. "You think I will not be in sympathy with your life and your aims and plans. You mistake. I admire them, I bow before them. I will accord you all sympathy and help. I will leave you as free as the human soul can and should be to follow out your higher views, and I will further them in every way in my power." She had tried to interrupt him, only distress on her face. "It is not that, Mr. Gardner. Do you not know that your life is not in accord with the one to whom I owe allegiance, that the supreme love of your soul is not for him, and that, therefore, you cannot be in sympathy with his work and worship?" Perhaps the poor, self-absorbed human heart may be almost excused for making even a haughty reply under such circumstances. Mr. Gardner, not being able to reach the plane of life where she stood, did not understand her. "Surely," he had said, coldly, though evidently deeply pained, "you cannot desire a man to profess that which he does not possess in order to please you. You would not ask me to seek to be the sort of ideal character you would see me, simply for your sake. I have offered all there is of me. How can you ask more?" "I ask nothing for my sake," she had said hastily, and added, with deep earnestness, "I could wish indeed that for your own sake you would become the character I would like to see you, a character not ideal, but patterned after the man Christ Jesus. But I do not ask it for myself. You force me to add what sounds hard and perhaps hateful. That were you to become today the Christian man I long to see you, it would not alter in the slightest degree the answer I have already given you. The time when I would have had it otherwise is past." He had been walking at intervals with restless steps up and down the library during the latter part of this interview. With this sentence he turned and stopped before her, looking at her steadily, almost incredulously. "Is it so, Chrissy?" he said. "You do not care for me in the least?" "Not in that way, Mr. Gardner, though I value your friendship more than you can understand." He made a gesture almost of impatience. "Tell me this," he said. "Is there someone else who has usurped my place?" A scarlet flush dyed Chrissy's face for a moment, but she lifted grave, truthful eyes to his and answered steadily, "There is no one else." "Then I will go," he said after a moment's pause. "No," in answer to her low-spoken sentence, "I have nothing to forgive. Neither am I angry, of course. At least, I do not think I am. I seem to be stunned. Goodbye, Chrissy." But, if he was not angry, there was certainly one who was. Also, she was bewildered, as Ches Gardner had been, though not stunned. Poor Chrissy could almost have wished that the news, forced from her unwilling lips, could have had that effect for a time on her mother. That a girl in her senses, and in Chrissy's position, the second daughter of a poor man who gave away half his living and had a family of younger ones to provide for, could actually have refused a man like Ches Gardner, was beyond her comprehension. She rang the changes on it until her poor daughter felt as though almost everything was going beyond her own comprehension. "After encouraging him constantly, too, for weeks and months." This and kindred sentences were often on the mother's lips, to Chrissy's infinite distress. She had made a careful reply once, she had opened her mouth once or twice since, to add to that reply, and then had closed it again, with a sense of bitter pain. It was one of those half-truths which have the power to sting sensitive consciences. Having settled her own duty in the matter, and put down with resolute will and conscience the special interest which she believed she could have felt for this man, clearly she ought not to have acted as though there were no other heart but her own to look after, as though she had no responsibility in regard to his comfort in life. "I did not think he meant anything but friendliness after that one time," she told herself miserably, and added with unsparing truthfulness, "In fact, I did not think anything about him after he disappointed me. That is what makes the trouble and the shame. I ought to have thought. I was absorbed and selfish." But so was she absorbed now, never more so in her life. The new society seemed fairly to possess her. With a humbled feeling that she owed it all the spiritual strength she had, and with a wholesome memory of the fact that in her first absorption it had stolen from her that which she ought not to have given, namely, the time for study and prayer and home duties, she entered upon the work forewarned, and enjoyed it as she had not known that actual work could be enjoyed. That she missed Mr. Gardner, she frankly admitted to herself and to her home friends. He went away almost immediately after that last interview. It was impossible not to feel a sense of loneliness, as well as a sense of disappointment over the thought that the Christian Endeavor Society, which he had so kindly helped to form, had been only a pain, and in no way a blessing to him. But it was such a pleasure to her to be taken to and from the meetings by Harmon, to realize his growing interest in the work, to recognize his helpfulness in a dozen little ways of which Ches Gardner had never thought, that perhaps it would have been an added humiliation to that gentleman to have known that, after all, his place was almost more than filled by the young lady's brother. Also, it was such a joy to Chrissy to see her father's joy in Harmon. Half the burden of his life seemed to have been lifted from his shoulders. Altogether, Chrissy could not but feel that although there certainly had been some hard places, yet, after all, the year had been one of growth and happiness. She stood musing about it that moonlighted June evening quite alone. Mrs. Hollister was dining with her married daughter uptown. The doctor was on his endless round of visits. Harmon had, a few moments before, looked in to say, "Chrissy, I shall not be at home until midnight or after. I'm to lead that railroad prayer meeting at the roundhouse tonight, and the men do not get in until 11. Just mention it to father, will you?" "Very well," Chrissy had said, smiling in memory of the time when to give her father a message about Harmon coming in at midnight would have made his heart ache. Such a little time ago, too. And now how easy it was to trust Harmon's comings and goings. "It was just a year ago to-night," said Chrissy in her pleasant musings, "that I took that strangely written pledge card in my hand, shivering as I touched it. What if I had signed the terrible thing? What if I had not signed the other, and had just stayed the half discontented butterfly that I was? I suppose they are all gathered in the great parlor now. Nellie, too. I'm glad she could go there just now, but it is lonely without her. I suppose Stewart Holmes is there by this time. He was to take his vacation in June, and of course he would spend it there. I wonder when he and Nellie will be married. It seems almost strange that she tells me nothing about it. Yet, I don't know, I don't believe I would be one to be always telling things, provided I had anything to tell. I don't suppose I shall ever marry," thought this sweet, wise old lady of 19. "I shall live with Harmon, perhaps. I do hope he will get me a sister to love. How bright the moonlight is tonight. I wonder if I am just a little lonesome. I should like to be with Grace and all of them in Western just for this evening. That's not the office bell, anyway." With this abrupt conclusion, she dropped the curtain she had been holding as she looked out into the moonlighted world, and came forward into the front parlor, ready to receive a possible guest. "How do you do?" said Stewart Holmes, holding out his hand in hearty greeting. End of chapter 30. Chapter 31. The Final Chapter of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 31. A Voluble Historian. "Yes," said Mrs. Hollister, rocking back and forth gracefully in her large easy chair, a complacent smile on her handsome face, "they have both gone to Western. It is a kind of Mecca to them, I believe. It is really amusing to me to see how attached Chrissy is to that little village. I've never seen the place yet myself. They tell me it is lovely in summer, but the loveliness is largely in their imagination, I fancy. Mrs. Dunsmore, wouldn't you find that large great chair more comfortable? How pleasant it does seem to have you sitting here again with me. Does it seem possible that it is more than a year since you went abroad?" "Oh, I never had any great expectations of going abroad. I used to think my children would, but I don't know. Louise has quite settled down to housekeeping and motherhood. She has a little witch of a daughter, you know, calls her Christine Hollister, the full name. She says she doesn't know how in the world she ever dared to do it. The idea of having another Chrissy Hollister in the family to manage! But I tell her if she brings hers up as well as I did mine, she may have reason to be thankful. Oh yes, both weddings are to be in June. Chrissy went on for this one, 2 weeks before the time, then they all come back with her. Harmon is to hover midway between Western and the home of an old classmate of his, a few miles from here, but I don't suppose the classmate will see much of him. Grace the name is, Grace Norton, a lovely girl, not in society much. She is high-toned and very dignified. Not at all the sort you would have supposed Harmon would select. Not that she is not everything that could be desired, but they are very unlike. He is so merry and full of life. Well, she has life enough too, but a demure way of showing it. The doctor is very fond of her. Chrissy pretends to be jealous because he admires her so much. Oh, no, she doesn't live in Western, but she has an aunt there of whom she is very fond, and with whom she has always spent her summers. I think, indeed, she spent one winter with her after she graduated. Her mother is an invalid, and they have always had to board, so I suppose really the aunt's seems the home-like place. Chrissy says it is a charming, old-fashioned house. It is where she stayed 2 years ago, when she went away. Don't you remember? We were all at Sea Rest together, and Chrissy was at Western. That is where all this romance begun." "The society? Oh dear, yes. She is as eager over it as ever. I presume she will organize 6 in New York City before she has been there a month. Her enthusiasm knows no bounds. And it is really a wonderful thing, Mrs. Dunsmore. You would be surprised to know how it has developed our young people. Dr. Dullard says he would not have imagined that less than 2 years could bring about such changes." "Yes, my children are all in it. Harmon is the president now. You wouldn't have imagined my boy Harmon presiding over an organization like that, would you? Leading its prayer meetings, you know, and leading all sorts of meetings, for that matter. Hard at work among the railroad men he is, and the streetcar men, and all sorts of men." "Oh, yes, just as much of a fanatic as his sister is. They are very much alike. A comfortable sort of fanaticism it is, too. When I hear mothers worrying about their sons, where they spend their evenings, and who their associates are, and sighing over their bad habits, I can hardly help feeling a little bit vain. We never had but the one, to be sure, but we have succeeded in bringing him up so that his whereabouts and his associates never give us a moment of anxiety. On the contrary, if I can say, as I do to many a mother, my son Harmon has your boy in charge, I saw them go by together, or I heard him say he was going with him to the park, why, I just rejoice with them over the instant feeling of relief that spreads over their faces." "Oh, indeed, it is a comfort. Mrs. Ward said to me only the other evening, 'Dear Mrs. Hollister, do you have any idea what a blessing your son is to this city?' She has 2 rather wild sons, poor woman. Not hard, you know, but frisky. Smoke a good deal, and are fond of horses, and that sort of thing. Harmon seems to be peculiarly interested in young men of that stamp, and he really has the most unbounded influence over them. His father thinks he is wonderful, but I don't know. He was brought up with refined tastes and a love for home, you know, and such young men naturally reach out helping hands when they get where they can." "Oh, yes, indeed. His wife will sympathize most heartily with all that sort of thing. She is a worker in this same society in Western. A great power, Chrissy says, and I can well imagine it." "No, they are not going to live with us. They will set up an establishment of their own, on Clark Place. Why, that stone house just around the corner from Eustis Avenue is the place. I forget that you have been away so long. Harmon says he selected that one day when he was a boy, because he thought it would be such a convenient center from which to get to all parts of the city. The streetcar lines diverge there, you know. You can see where his sympathies were, even when a boy. His heart is so bound up in work for the railroad men that even so long ago as that, it seems he was planning for it. He says he is going to have his father and mother come to dinner at his house, as Louise does. It positively makes one feel old to hear them talk." "Oh, yes, Louise and her husband are both in the church. My children all are, indeed, but Sarah. Her time will come, I've no doubt. Religious training tells. I brought up my children from their babyhood to respect the church. Louise isn't as absorbed as her sister, of course. She has her home and her family to look after. I tell Chrissy she will see a difference when she is married, but she doesn't believe it. Well, the temperaments of the 2 are different. They never will be much alike. Louise resembles me, while Chrissy is all father. We are evenly divided as a family. Harmon and Chrissy are like their father. Well, and little Fay too, all intensity and enthusiasm, you know, while Louise and Sarah are more like me, take things quietly and are not tempted to rush into extremes, though I have no occasion to quarrel with the extremes which my children have chosen. Horace, my son-in-law, is rather inclined to be enthusiastic. Louise is a good balance for him. Harmon has a great influence over Horace. He wasn't in the church, you know, until after Harmon took such a remarkable stand. He became interested that very evening, indeed. Oh, as to Chrissy, I don't know when the child wasn't different from everybody else. But she became absorbed in this new society that summer at Western, and met there the gentleman whom she is to marry. Haven't I told you his name yet? What an idea! And he is to be my son-in-law in 3 weeks more. Holmes it is, Stewart Holmes. Yes, it is an aristocratic name. He is of a very fine family. Not wealthy, you know, but old and high-toned, a family of scholars. Stewart is a banker. He will be a rich man, I think, without doubt. Horace says he is indispensable in the bank. Oh, he is one of the most remarkable Christians I ever knew, and a man of marked talent. Dr. Dullard says he ought to be in the church, and that Chrissy would make simply a wonderful minister's wife. But I believe Stewart had an idea that he could do more good as a man of business, with his money, I presume, and I confess that I would quite as soon have Chrissy the wife of a banker as a minister. That life is so hard. Then they are always tied to their churches, unable to get away anywhere. I should not wonder if Chrissy had a chance to go abroad sometime. Business men go over there a great deal nowadays, you know. He has a very pleasant home for her in New York. Oh, yes, indeed. I have reason to be entirely satisfied in my children. I have a great admiration for my prospective son-in-law. Oh, dear Mrs. Dunsmore, do you remember that fancy of mine? Well, to be frank, I did certainly suppose for a time that Chrissy would be Mrs. Chess Gardner. But there is no accounting for a girl's tastes. Of course, I prefer the other one now. But I did not know him at the time, and Chess was so attentive and so unexceptional. Poor fellow, I thought for a while that he was utterly heartbroken. No, he is not married, but he is soon to be. Oh, no. There was no break between him and Chrissy, at least not for long. They are intimate friends, quite like brother and sister. He is to marry a friend of Chrissy's. Quite a romantic thing it is. She is poor, a school teacher, an orphan, and quite dependent on herself. And here she is going to be Mrs. Chess Gardner, with all sorts of elegancies, and a wedding trip to Naples, and all that kind of thing. Isn't Dame Fortune a queer creature? Of all persons to select for a wife for Chess Gardner, the last one I should have chosen would have been Nellie Tudor. If my Harmon had fancied her, I should not have been so surprised. She is so merry and childish. Chess is so intellectual and so stately that one would have supposed his choice would have been very different. Not that I would have cared to have Harmon marry her, but I thought at one time that he would. They were quite intimate friends, and we became very much attached to her. Still, I confess I was anxious lest Harmon should choose her. It seemed a sort of pity some way, when he could make a choice where he pleased. To tell the truth, I rather took Chrissy to task for being intimate with her and leading her brother into temptation. I think the child got an impression that I didn't like her and stayed away from here. She was living with an aunt on Meridian Street. I never dreamed, you see, that I was cutting the future Mrs. Chess Gardner. She's a pretty creature, and when she comes back from Europe, I suppose will be quite the fashion. Oh, no, she will never be a society lady. She is too much like Chrissy for that. Chrissy has molded her a good deal, and Chess Gardner too, for that matter. She has such a remarkable influence over all her friends. I am certainly wonderfully blessed in my children, Mrs. Dunsmore." Here occurred an interruption, in the person of a tall, pale girl in black, who entered quietly with a note which she gave to Mrs. Hollister and glided away. Whereupon the guest, Mrs. Hollister's seaside friend and especial confidant of years, remarked that the girl's face looked familiar some way, yet she couldn't place it, and asked where she was picked up. "Why, it is familiar," said Mrs. Hollister, started at once on a new track. "Don't you remember my Emmeline? She was second girl when you went abroad. A pretty, graceful creature, with rosy cheeks and a quantity of fluffy hair." "Yes, this is the very girl. You wouldn't believe that less than 2 years could make such a change, would you? She has a sad story, poor thing, and quite romantic, too. She became fascinated with a low fellow who belonged to a traveling circus and married him. We tried in every way to prevent it, of course, but to no purpose. The fellow led her a terrible life, was positively cruel to her, struck her and all that. They brought up, don't you think, in London at last. Think of my Emmeline in London! There the fellow abandoned her, and Ches Gardner met her wandering through the streets alone, and starving, and frightened almost out of her senses. He befriended her, and found her miserable husband for her. But the wretch died, fortunately, and then Ches wrote to Chrissy about Emmeline. Romantic, wasn't it? I was inclined to have nothing to do with her, so ungrateful in her to leave us in the first place, you know, and go off with the fellow. But Ches pled eloquently, and Chrissy was determined, and the end of it was, he sent her home, paid her passage, and saw that she was decently clothed, did everything, in fact, as though she had been a dependent of his, all for Chrissy's sake, I think. He knew she was fond of Emmeline, but Chrissy said it was for Christ's sake. That is her style of sentiment, you know. She manages me with the rest of them. So I took Emmeline back. I must say the girl is a comfort. I'm having my reward for being charitable. She is fond of us all, and devoted to my daughter Fay. Yes, we are all going to Western the last of next week. That is Chrissy's fancy, that her father is to spend a Sabbath there, and go to church with her. I don't know why, I am sure. Then we return, and make all haste getting ready for Chrissy's wedding. Ches Gardner and his lady are to be her attendants. Oh, it is all as romantic as possible. I am so glad you will be here to meet my handsome new son-in-law. He is much the finest looking of them all." This voluble historian reeled out her story as given above, toward the setting sun of another June day, perfect as to air and earth and sky. Especially perfect far away from the city, in the pretty little village of Western, where, at that particular moment, in a pretty cottage room, exactly the room, by the way, in which you first met her, Chrissy stood by the dressing bureau, her hair all in a wealth of soft disorder flowing over her dressing sack, and smiling to herself in the mirror. The special occasion of her smiles was that she had at that moment discovered a new decoration on the mirror frame. Winding in among the vines and the birds, with which Grace Norton's hand, you may remember, had decorated that mirror for her friend, were 5 letters, looking to the unwary like stems of flowers and vines, with merely the semblance of a letter here and there, but taking the shape to Chrissy's amused eyes in the old watch cry, YPSCE. "Grace," she called, and that maiden from across the hall responded and came smiling to the door. "What do these letters mean which I have found roving over this mirror?" began Chrissy, and then broke into sweet laughter, springing back to wind her arms around Grace Norton's neck, and say between the kisses, "Oh, Gracie, Gracie, to think that you are going to be my sister! Grace, isn't life wonderful? There, somebody is going to call you. Somebody always did. It is Harmon, though, this time. He will always be calling you after this." "No, it isn't," laughed Grace. "It is Stewart, and he is asking for you. He always was asking for you in the old days, and he always will be after this." Chrissy disengaged herself in haste, her face all in a bright flush. "Won't you go, Grace, and tell him I will be down in a few minutes?" Then the business of dressing went on with much more speed than it had 2 years before. In the hall below they were waiting for her, her brother Harmon and Stewart Holmes. Stewart had been for a day or two in Western, Chrissy and Harmon had arrived but that afternoon. To Harmon Hollister, if one had time, you would need an introduction. At least, some of his old acquaintances found it difficult to recognize him. The slight, delicate form had rounded out. The pallid, pinched look was entirely gone from his face. No trace of the old, almost constant cough remained. So much had regular hours and careful habits, and the rigid banishing of cigars and wine, and the grace of God in the heart, done for this almost hopeless invalid. "We want to advise with you," said Stewart Holmes. "Harmon finds a note begging him to go to Carlton this evening, to hold a meeting at the roundhouse, and to bring me with him. The men will be in at 10 o'clock for an hour, and not again, all of them, for several nights." "Where is Carlton?" Chrissy asked. 7 miles below here. It would necessitate a start soon after supper." "Oh." The monosyllable was long drawn out, and the tone, it must be confessed, decidedly regretful. "Just for this one evening, couldn't you both be here? It is a sort of anniversary, you know." "I know. I had the courage to propose it," said Stewart Holmes, smiling. "But your brother Harmon does not at all approve." Chrissy turned and looked at her tall, handsome brother. Some memory of a more recent past came floating over her. How she said to him once something like this: "Can you think what a joy it would be to me to hear it said, 'Harmon Hollister does not approve of it,' and to know that thoughtful people would reply, 'If such a man as Harmon Hollister does not approve, it needs thinking about.'" "His work first, Chrissy," Harmon said gently, a shade of regret for her disappointment in his voice. "Yes," said Chrissy heartily, and smiled. End of chapter 31. End of Chrissy's Endeavor by Pansy. Recorded by TriciaG. Thanks for listening.